Just before we start, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting here on today and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. And maybe also to just make an acknowledgement that young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are significantly more at risk of suicide and self-harm than non-Aboriginal young people, and just to encourage us all to sort of hold that in our minds while we're talking here today. So Zoe and I are going to talk to you about a project. I'd actually also like to thank Liz for giving us such a fantastic introduction to our project. But we're going to talk to you about a project that we're incredibly proud of at Orygen, and it's called the Chat Safe Project, which was really about developing some tools and resources and guidelines to support young people to have conversations about suicide safely online, and particularly on social media. So as we know, and as Liz has very graciously set up for us, social media sites are commonly used by young people to talk about suicide and suicide-related behaviour with others. They provide a really important platform when often young people find it difficult to have those conversations in their face-to-face worlds, and particularly with us as adults and professionals. And although young people don't intentionally have those conversations in a harmful way, we do know that in terms of thinking about suicide and self-harm, the potential for harm exists. And we've seen some very high-profile cases, most recently probably in the UK, with the suicide of a young girl whose parents really attributed that to images that she'd seen on Instagram and Pinterest. So we know that there's particular concerns around things like contagion and distressing images and distressing content that can potentially lead to certainly distress, but also copycat type behaviour in other people. So we know that the young people tend not to try and harm others, but we know that that potential for harm exists. So I think in response to the fact that communicating about suicide in media generally can be problematic, what we know is that there are guidelines that have been developed here in Australia, so the Mindframe guidelines, but also elsewhere in the world around advising media in terms of how to communicate safely about suicide, or how to report safely about suicide. And they've been very well received by the media professionals, but also by the community and sector and policymakers and so on around the world. But we also know that with social media, those sorts of guidelines that really are targeting media professionals are likely to have limited utility when it comes to supporting young people to communicate safely about suicide on social media type platforms. We're now all journalists, so we need to be thinking about how we can empower ourselves and others to have conversations safely rather than just focusing on media professionals. So it really made us start to think about how can we best support young people to have some of these conversations safely. So it led us to the Chat Safe study. We were very lucky to get some funding from the Commonwealth Government to do this piece of work. And really what we've set out to do was develop a set of evidence-informed guidelines about safe and helpful peer-to-peer communication about suicide on social media, and to then bring the guidelines to life via a national social media campaign. So again, what we know is that a kind of a 20-page document of guidelines sitting on Orygen's website is again going to have limited utility or traction with young people. So we really then wanted to find ways of bringing those guidelines to life in a way that was going to resonate for young people. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the development of the guidelines, and then I'm going to hand over to Zoe, who's going to talk a little bit about the campaign co-design process that we've been doing with our digital media colleagues and with young people from across the country. So in terms of the guideline development, what we did was we conducted a Delphi consensus study. So Delphi studies they're expert consensus studies. They're often done when it's difficult to generate evidence in other ways. It starts with a really rigorous systematic search of the peer-reviewed and great literature. So we looked at, what other experts around the world had said one should do when communicating about suicide on social media. And we took that from the peer-reviewed literature, but also from other sets of media guidelines. So, for example, the Mindframe guidelines that I referred to earlier. So anything that talked a little bit about how you should communicate about suicide on social media, we took that out. We extracted those from the literature search, and we developed a big questionnaire on the basis of that, of all those items. And I'll show you a glimpse of how we structured the questionnaire shortly. The next step was to develop some expert panels. And so we did that in a couple of ways. We had a panel that was made up of professionals, so they were academics or people who had been involved in the development of guidelines, and we identified, that was an international panel, and we identified that from all the peer-reviewed literature that we'd looked at. And then we had a panel of youth experts as well, so people who were experts in their own experience of being young and using social media in a way that we probably, our generation certainly doesn't. So we recruited those young people through our own networks, through Orygen and Headspace's networks of young people. Then what happens is we send the questionnaires, and there was, I think you can see, nearly 300 items, I think, on that first questionnaire. Everybody, all the panels received the questionnaire. They got to rate every single item on the questionnaire as to whether they thought it should be included or not. Everything that got over 80% of consensus from both panels was included in the guidelines. Under 70% got booted out, and anything in between, people got to re-rate. So in that way, what we got was absolute consensus between our professionals and our young people about what these guidelines needed to include. And from that, we were able to develop our chat-safe guidelines. So this just gives you a general idea of what was included, how the questionnaire was structured. So we had sections on some sort of general tips around communicating about suicide. So stuff that you would see in other forms of other types of guidelines. So things around language, maybe don't say committed suicide, maybe say died by suicide instead. So things like that in general tips. Then we had a section on things you might want to consider before posting, communication about somebody that you know who is affected by suicide, and so on. So you can see all the categories there. So we divided the questionnaire up into all of these different categories, and then under these categories were multiple items that everybody got to rate for their inclusion in the guidelines. And actually, the only other thing that I just comment on is this bit. So a lot of the content in here you might think is kind of fairly generic to any form of guidelines around communicating about suicide, but there are some sections that were quite specific to online and social media type content. So things like monitoring online content, understanding that once a post is shared, it's potentially always there, and content around memorial groups and closed groups that are often set up when somebody's died by suicide. So there were some things that were quite specific to social media that were in here as well. And before I talk about what the guidelines actually look like, I wanted to just draw your attention, and I won't spend too much time on this because I think Zoe's going to come back to it a little bit later. But some examples of excluded items. So things got excluded when you couldn't reach over 70% or 80% of consensus between both of our panels. And I think what's interesting here, what I always find interesting here, is where things got excluded because our professionals and our young people didn't agree. And bearing in mind these are guidelines for young people, so we very much wanted our young people's voices to be heard loud and clear. And I think there were some things where you could see they almost reached consensus, so perhaps if we were to do this again in a couple of years' time, these items would get up, so things like approving comments before they're publicly shown. But things like this really interest me. So this is a comment that was, if you see a post and think somebody might be at risk of suicide, reach out to the person directly. And, you know, what you can see here is that our professionals were like, ooh, no, we don't necessarily think people should do that. But our young people were like, yes, of course we should do that. Why wouldn't we do that? And, you know, Zoe might talk about this in a bit more detail as a much younger person than I am. But I think in lots of ways it probably reflects the different ways that that young people and people of my generation use the internet. So for young people, their on and offline worlds are very integrated. So if they're worried about a person online, why on earth wouldn't they reach out to them directly? They don't necessarily distinguish online worlds with real life in the way that I do. But it also probably reflects that I think professionals are feeling quite protective over young people and really understand the complexity of reaching out to somebody who might be suicidal and don't want young people to necessarily feel that burden of having to keep somebody alive, potentially. So it really, you know, I just think it's interesting to look at where the differences lie sometimes in where in terms of what our professionals and our young people thought. But this is what we ended up with in terms of our guidelines. This is sort of what they look like. So the structure is really around the questionnaire items as you saw them. But they also reflect the different ways young people go online to talk about suicide. So what are people looking for? So they might want to help, and they might want to help themselves, or they might want to help somebody else. So they can sort of choose their own adventure around the guidelines. So what do they want to do if they want to help themselves? Perhaps they want to share their own story or their own experience of suicide, and they want to do that in a safe way. Or if they want to help somebody else, Do they think that person might be at risk of suicide? No, but they want to have a conversation anyway, so how do they do that in a safe way? But if they are worried about somebody being at risk, what do they do? What's a safe way to respond to somebody who might be suicidal? And then that other little last section is really about how to engage in memorial groups and closed groups safely. So again, we know that those sorts of groups can offer a real sense of community. They can really help young people engage with the grieving process and honour the person that they've lost to suicide. But we also know for other people they can be quite triggering if different people are at different stages of a grieving process, and people might end up being exposed to content that they're going to find quite distressing. So it's really all about, well, how do we operate those sorts of groups safely? So just some kind of examples of what you would see in the guidelines. The guidelines are all freely available, and I'll put up the web link shortly. But again, you know, as per that structure that I showed you, before you post anything about suicide online, remember that those posts may go viral. Remember that they'll be there for all to see. So even if you choose to remove the post later, somebody might have screenshotted it, shared it, you lose control of what you see. So really encouraging young people to step back and have a think about what they want to share before they share it. We've also got some content about language and safety tips. So again, you know, reminding people what might be unhelpful language for people to see. So language like committed suicide, which can be quite stigmatizing for people. But rather than tell young people what not to do, we also gave them some helpful alternatives. So rather than trying to shut down the conversation, so you mustn't talk about this online, this is perhaps less helpful, but here are some helpful alternatives. Here's an alternative, here's some language that you might use if you want to have these conversations. So we were very much about empowering young people and giving them the skills to have these conversations safely, not shutting down the conversations at all. Again, you know, there's some stuff in, there's some content around how to share your own experience safely. You know, you might want to avoid certain graphic images of self-harm or suicide attempts. You might want to avoid details of location and methods of suicide because we know that can be unhelpful type content. And you might want to consider, and you know, we make recommendations to young people saying you might not want to include graphic images, but we also know that young people don't always do what we think that they should do. So what we've got is, but if you choose to do this anyway, you might want to include some trigger warnings so that other young people can make some informed choices around what they're going to expose themselves to today. And young people might feel, today I feel pretty good and I feel strong and I'm going to look at this content, but tomorrow I might not. And so, you know, it gives young people agency over how they engage with this topic online. And it also gives some practical examples, again, of how to respond to somebody who might be suicidal, including some helpline numbers, actually, and sort of, you know, our Lifeline Kids Helpline and eHeadspace numbers as well, so people can link in directly to professional help and resources if necessary. And again, this was really about kind of memorial pages. But the other thing that we really wanted to do was just remind people that it can be distressing to be exposed to this type of content online. So to really look after yourself as well. So this is the other thing that we've included, is some points about self-care and how to, you know, take responsibility to step away from the internet sometimes if you're recognizing it's not making you feel good, or, you know, how might you kind of moderate the content that you're exposed to. So there's a whole section in there about self-care, about talking to somebody else about how you might be feeling, and about looking after yourself, as I say, taking a break perhaps, or taking control of the content that you see. So again, it's all about giving young people agency to keep themselves safe when talking about suicide online. So I'm going to hand over to Zoe to talk a little bit about bringing the guidelines to life. Just that little arrow.
This one. Oh, okay. Hello, hello, hello. Happy Thursday. It's Friday tomorrow. Hang tight, guys. Do I bring this down? Okay. Is that better? Okay. Hello. Just a little correction. I'm not currently working at the Melbourne University anymore. So I'm at Swinburne University doing research. I should probably update my bio. Sorry about that. Okay. Co-design. What's co-design? Well, I had no idea what this was until ChatSave, but now apparently I'm giving a talk about it. Who knew? Okay, so we worked closely with Portable, a company that specializes in this kind of work. And the benefit of co-design over traditional focus groups is that it's more engaging and interactive. And it's also really important in this case to actually include young people, to give them a chance to say what they want and need, as opposed to us assuming what they need or want. It also acknowledges the fact that young people are their own experts when it comes to dealing with social media and suicide prevention. Yeah, so basically we ran workshops with young people from a range of groups. So we had people from -18, people from Headspace, Reach Out, and the one on the top right there, how do I do the click thing?
There's a little
this button?
dot in the middle.
Oh, okay. So in this group here, that was one of the earliest workshops that we had, and we were lucky enough to be invited by Facebook to run it at the office. And it was really fun because a lot of the young people got to see a little behind the scenes at what Facebook actually does and what the office space would look like. And we also got to look at some features that Facebook had that I didn't even know, where you could use to help deal and cope with distressing posts that you see on your newsfeed. So what does the workshop actually look like, or what did we even do? So prior to each workshop, everyone was asked to create a little wellness plan. We also had a clinical psychologist on call, so that if anyone at any time during the workshop felt a bit overwhelmed, they could step out and have a private chat. This way, everyone was always supported during and after the workshop. So the session would usually start with a brief stretching or yoga or some games just to break the ice a little bit. And then after, we also had a huge group discussion, and we created our own, I guess, mini guidelines or group rules, and we wrote them up on a little flip chart that everyone signed as well, just so that everyone knew that they had a safe space where they could express and share their stories. And then we were then put into little groups of 3 and 4, and each group had a lead from either Portable or Orygen. And then depending on the goals of the workshop, so for example, in one, the earliest ones, we looked at, okay, what does it look like when a young person goes on Facebook and sees something that's actually a bit distressing? So in that case, we kind of created a little storyboard and we drew pictures, and then in another workshop, for example, we went, okay, we've created these guidelines. It's a really big document. How are we gonna actually bring this to life? So as you can see in these ones here, we were then asked, okay, so you can have this section of the guidelines. Which part in this bit do you think most resonate with you? And then how can you actually maybe bring that up into like a little video or something? So in that workshop, we were given Play-Doh, Lego, we had little cut-up pieces, and so we got to actually create a little storyboard. We wrote a script, and then I think in my group, we did a bit of stop motion, which was really fun. And then at the end, everyone could present as well what they found and what they created. Yeah, so each workshop is unique, and it depends on what your goals are, and it depends on who you're actually working with. For example, in the workshop with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, they had a yarding circle where storytelling was encouraged, and that way it was a safe and I guess comfortable way for people of that background to share their experiences. In another workshop, we also looked at the idea of maybe having a chat box. So how is this chat box going to look like? What's the design going to look like? Will it actually work? Will people actually use a chat box? So you can see in this one over here, we had some people actually test out this chat box and to see whether or not that, hey, this might actually be useful for me. So yeah, each workshop is unique, and it is quite a lot of fun. You often see like lots of bits and pieces everywhere, like butcher's paper, Play-Doh, like kinetic sand. And it didn't really feel like you were, I guess, participating in research. It felt more of like you were creating something brand new. So at the end of each workshop, we would also do a little cool down activity. So that could involve a 10-minute guided mindfulness session. That way, again, everyone can feel supported and safe, and that they can also reset before going home. All right, so these are just some of the findings that came out from the workshops. And as you can see, a lot of young people want to feel heard and to feel safe. I think these days, especially being a millennial, you get a bit of a bad rep. But a lot of us want to have the chance to actually express ourselves in a safe and comfortable way. We don't want to be judged. We don't want to be ridiculed. We just want to actually, say what we feel. We want active and adaptable resources as opposed to having like a list of numbers that you're meant to call when you feel down. We want to have these conversations started for us. So I want to bring you back to when you were in high school or when you're still studying in uni, where a teacher would ask you a really difficult question, and then you get that really awkward 10-minute of silence that just keeps stretching on and on and on, and no one wants to speak up. This applies here as well. We want relatable messages and stories of hope. And I think that makes sense as well. If you want to hear about how other people like yourself actually overcame their issues and their problems, because if they can do it, then maybe I could actually do it too one day. And we want visible support options. So like maybe having a chat box that you can click on Facebook, or maybe having a big red button that helps you block certain images that could be triggers to you. And then in our workshop with minority groups as well, as you can see, depending on the group that you're running it with, you can actually learn a lot as well. So each group has their own specific needs and wants, and it's really important to think about that there is no one size fits all. And it's always important to include diversity as well, especially when you're dealing with something like suicide prevention in young people. I'm not going to go through all of these differences, but I think one big common one that came out was that young people want visual and bite-sized content to help them cope with what they're dealing with. And again, this highlights the importance of actually including young people in creating, these guidelines and bringing them to life in a way so that that this is actually going to help the people you're trying to help. And it's also important to bear in mind and to also remember that it's about learning and listening to what they want and to what they need, as opposed to assuming what we think they need or what we think they want. So as Joe briefly touched on before, I just want to bring us back to this slide. So you can see this one here, where it was found that young people were more likely to reach out to someone who they thought were distressed. When I looked at that, I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. I already do that. My friends do it. My siblings do it. So I wasn't really that surprised, but I think others, like Joe as well, was a bit surprised. They're like, oh, wait, this is a thing? Like, people actually want to help others? Again, I guess there is a little bit of a hesitation when it comes to having these difficult conversations, and a bit of a hesitation in actually including young people in these conversations. But I think it's almost essential that you do. So I guess my take-home message would be that I think when you're doing research for a while, it's really easy to forget the kind of impact that you're going to have on the people you're trying to help. And I guess one of the biggest lessons I learned from these workshops is that, yes, we came in to this project and to these workshops as participants, but when we came out, we became agents of our own social change. We became agents and experts, actually, in letting other people know what it is that we want, what it is that we want to see, and what kind of change that we want to actually occur. And with that in mind, I'm going to handball it back to Joe, who's going to go over the evaluation and a little bit of a sneak peek as to what's coming up next.
Thanks. Awesome, thanks. So I always hate following young people when I'm giving a talk, because they always do such a better job. But that's just awesome, and really captured what we were really trying to do and aiming to do with the whole co-design process. It was really about listening to young people about what's going to resonate for them in terms of bringing these guidelines to life. And what was really interesting is, and listening to Zoe say it there was fantastic for us really, because what we are trying to do is co-create with young people a social media campaign about safe communication about suicide, But what's also happened along the way is that the young people that have taken part in our workshops, and as you can see, there's over 100 of them, have actually gained some kind of intrinsic benefits to themselves for having been part of the workshops as well. So that was just like almost a fantastic byproduct for us of doing all of these workshops. We were very focused on finding safe ways to talk to young people and engage young people in co-design activities around suicide. But what we did was not only create a safe environment and safe ways of doing that, we actually created something that was very beneficial to young people, and that's been quite an important learning for us. So without harping on too much about all of this, what you can see is we've had about 100 young people from across the country take part in our workshops. Our frequent flyer points are going up and up. We've been all over the place. We've mostly captured people in metro areas. We've had a bit of a gender split. The mean age has been age of 21. We did a specific workshop with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people across in Western Australia at the end of last year. We've specifically targeted some LGBTQI groups in order to capture the needs and wants of that particular subgroup of the population, listening to, we all know why, particularly having listened to Liz's talk. And we also had a lot of culturally and linguistically diverse young people take part in the workshops. What you can see here is that a large proportion of the young people did have their own lived experience of mental ill health or suicide or supporting somebody else. It's probably largely a product of where we recruited young people through. So, for example, our own networks and our Headspace networks and so on. But in terms of this, in terms of the outcomes of the workshop, you can see that young people found it significantly beneficial. So they learned new skills, they've got a better understanding of communicating about suicide safely online, and generally they feel more confident, better equipped to provide emotional support to other people. They've enjoyed the workshops, and a very small percentage felt upset or suicidal as a result of taking part, and that was a really important finding for us. And as Zoe said, we had lots and lots of supports in place to support young people when they did feel a bit vulnerable as a result of the workshop, but by and large people had a very positive experience. And this is partly here to embarrass Ryan, who is in the audience, but also just to capture this that we saw, I think it was on LinkedIn or something after one of the workshops, and it was just a comment by one of our participants about how much she felt she'd benefited and gained from taking part. And again, it picked up the point that Zoe made, that she found it beneficial in and of itself, but also felt it was really important to be part of something bigger and really contributing to some aspect of change in terms of how we talk about suicide online. So just a real kind of, spoiler alert in terms of some of the campaign directions. So we are working with colleagues at Portable, some of whom are here in the audience today, around how we start to bring these guidelines to life. And this is what we've learned from all the different workshops that we've been running around the country over the last year and a half. So we've got some different campaign messages, and they're really focused on, do you want to talk? Is this something you want to talk about now? If so, how do you do that? And then the other aspect is around talking to me and being open and know how to respond safely if somebody wants to talk to you about their suicide-related feelings. And we're doing that in different ways. So we're about to road test all of this now with young people, again, from across the country. But we're looking at types of animation. And here we've got very kind of non-gendered kind of way of bringing people across, which is what we heard from our LGBTQI workshops. Why have everybody either male or female? Let's have some non-gendered representation in here. So we're looking at animation, we're looking at videos and different narratives, maybe from influencers. I really like the idea of digital storytelling. That came up in our Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander workshops. And then the idea of using imagery, so memes and messages and photos and those sorts of things. And here are just a couple of kind of really early examples of some of the ideas that we're about to start road testing with young people in our network. So here's a kind of a video of an influencer. I don't watch influencer videos because I'm 100 years old, but we know that young people do. Here's a kind of idea about how to chat if you want to talk about suicide. Here are some stills and images that we could push through things like Snapchat or Instagram around, safe tips when it comes to language. And then here are our next steps. So I'm ambitiously about to embark on a randomized controlled trial to test the impact of a social media campaign about suicide-related content. I know people in the audience are shaking their heads and looking at me sort of sympathetically. We'll see how that goes for me. So we're about to trial that because we really want to know whether this content is safe or not and whether it's actually going to work before we spend a lot of money developing a campaign that's not going to have traction with young people. So we're about to try and get this through the ethics committee, wish me luck. We'll then roll out a national campaign with the content that is proved to be effective and safe and acceptable. And we're also about to embark on a couple of developing some educational programs around the guidelines for educators and caregivers. So they're really our next steps. And just in terms of where you can find the guidelines, they're freely available on the Orygen website. We've also got a webinar that Zoe and I did a little while ago that's available on our YouTube channel. And we also did a Facebook Live event, which was amazing, very nerve-wracking for me, but amazing, and got a lot of traction. And we did that in partnership with BuzzFeed. So that was a really positive experience as well. So in the interest of time, I don't need to sum up too much. I think we've probably covered all of this in terms of young people seeing social media very much as part of the solution, not just the problem. And you can see in here, it's all really about giving young people agency and empowering them to have these conversations safely online. And just to finish, I would obviously like to thank our funders and our partners, and very much all of the young people that have taken part in our project. So thank you.